Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. And maybe a good morning. Welcome back to Deep Thoughts. So today, we're going to cover a subject that has been kind of floating around for the last year or so. And it's about nuclear bombs and whether or not they existed or exist. Now, for those of you who are new to this is the story. Most of us were raised with the utter fear that the nuclear holocaust was around the corner a couple times. And then recently someone said, you know what, these nuclear bombs never ever existed. They've just been a Cold War scare tactic to get the world to fear something bigger than the government, which was transforming itself from an entity by the people for the people into a tyrannical rebirth of various mechanisms like monarchies and that sort of thing, right? So they made us look the other way while they took over the country. And chronologically speaking, there is great correlation with that theory. From the 40s up, the United States of America was completely taken over by the Skull and Bones folks of the Yale University. It's not Yale University's fault. It just happens to be they host this place, this Skull and Bones group, of which both, three Bush families, all the Bush sons were members of Skull and Bones, are members of Skull and Bones. John Kerry's a member of Skull and Bones. The President Taft was the first Skull and Bones president. All the heads of the CIA and all the members of the CIA for the first 20 years were Skull and Bones. That's a real serious organization. So again, while we were worried about nukes, this other thing was happening. But that's not what this episode's about, but something to keep in the back of your brain. Why would someone fake nukes? There's a million reasons to fake nukes, but it could be the United States wanted Russia to be afraid of something, Russia wanted the United States to be afraid of something. But I know what you're thinking. If you've been raised your whole life with the fear of nuclear weapons, then anyone telling you that they don't exist and never have existed will piss you off, just like the folks that believe we went to the moon. There's a bunch of things to talk about here. A bunch of things. Let's just hit some high points here and we'll go back and dissect everything into pieces. Most of you have the courage to look at the moon missions and stop writing these assholes blank checks for having not actually been there, but continuing to claim that they've been there 6 times, that we got rovers on, Mars and landers on, Titan and orbiters around Jupiter, all that kind of stuff. We know that the United States of America lied to the public, the whole world, especially to the American citizens who contributed, was it $10 billion per launch or something like that? I think it's $10 billion overall, but prorated up, it's an amazing amount of money. But they lied to us, and they lied to the Russians to say we've been to the moon. And the Russians actually canned their booster rocket program, I believe, by 1973. Later we figured out that they made booster rockets way better than we did, and we use their rockets today. So we know that lies happen between countries to save face, to gain face, etc., etc. We know that China has lied to their people about putting a rover on the moon. It's just a matter of national pride, and if you can achieve it through propaganda, then these poor countries will do it, and we were and are still operating on that poor country mentality. But the nuclear weapons is slightly different, right? Now, all of us have seen movies of nuclear weapons going off, or at least that's what we're told. So we in our brains have been told that what we saw was generated by fission. And I'll explain the whole thing just in case you've never deep dived into the atomic physics of what a bomb is supposed to do. I also had a shop teacher in high school who was taught how to make dirty bombs. I've got very close friends of mine in their early 70s who grew up in Utah and watched the flashes come over mountains when nuclear bomb tests were being conducted. And he literally would say that he'd watch the announcement on TV that the bomb was going to go off. He'd run to the window, see the flash, and then run in his bedroom at about the age of 7 and cry because he was fearful that eventually this nuclear era thing was going to kill him. He also was raised in Nagasaki and was taken to Hiroshima. And he saw firsthand the damage of these nukes, supposedly in Japan. So where does this theory come from? That nuclear weapons did not exist. We've seen Bikini Islands, just so you guys know, my background in this is going to be twofold. It's going to be having been obsessed with this technology from a young age, figuring out how all of this stuff worked, from fat boy all the way up to, having a research project I worked on for a movie where it involved nuclear weapons, and I went and rehashed all my stuff. I've researched the radioactive properties against the human body, the radioactive properties against metals. So everything that is the phenomenon that exists around a nuclear weapon, I have studied if it's been published. So I should be able to come at this from a really educated angle for you guys. Above ground testing was outlawed in 1973, something you throw in the back of your mind. So everything that's been supposedly proven to be a nuclear bomb after 73 is a ground burst test. And it's going to get into this method that we can fake nuclear bomb explosions, the appearance of them, and then say it happened through a fission process, right? Here's what I will say right off the bat to support the theory, at least in part, that nuclear bombs may not exist. All the footage that you have seen from the 40s showing you the tests of nuclear bombs going off are most likely fake. These are the famous videos of a concussion wave hitting a house, a 2-story barrack, hitting a bus, hitting a bunch of trees that are all planted in a line, and the camera angles that supposedly filmed these events, because they're really close to the epicenter of this 1 megaton bomb. How do we know that footage is fake? Well, one, the amount of photography of these scenes, of these sets, these desert settings, and all of the props that were built to record this, to watch it in bunkers, all this has been heavily photographed. Like every square inch of the place has been photographed. And what you will never see, or at least I have never seen personally, are the photos of all of these reinforced bunkers that have cameras about 30 to 50 feet in the air, in such a way that when a concussive wave comes by and hits the camera, that it is so reinforced in some cement bunker. Believe me, it would have to be in a cement bunker, probably lined with lead and packed with cement, because the radioactive EMP wave that's coming at the film inside the camera would expose the film and the camera, for one. But two, the camera never shakes. These incredible waves of energy that seem to knock down these buildings, which behave a little bit like models, like not like a toy, dollhouse, but a big model. They don't seem to really behave properly. It seems almost as if a barrack miniature had been built 10, 20 feet high. I mean, not even 20 feet high, but 10 feet high, and you blast a conventional weapon with a lot of, fire and concussion, and you do get this, push out, suck back thing. But the trees that were, the famous trees that bend in the wind, they're trees that have been alive for quite a while, and somehow planted in a line to test nuclear weapons. You see them in these ridiculous Johnny Appleseed lines, and it's the desert. So trees like that don't grow in the desert to begin with. So someone would have to have artificially planted those trees or moved them in place to test this thing out. Any of you who've transplanted trees know that it takes years for the substitute, the roots to take root in soil, and if the soil isn't nitrated well, which desert soil is not for a tree, the tree would simply die. And if hit by a nuclear weapon, at least one of those trees would fall over. Those of you who grew up in Kansas with me, or the Midwest, you know that when a tornado bumps a lot of trees, they just fall over. And they have very small, root patches underneath. So the idea that these trees were so well rooted that they stuck in the ground during a nuclear blast is hard to believe, if not impossible to believe, in all cases, right? All the trees stayed in the ground. How did they get planted there? How did they take root so quickly? Even if you gave them 5 years, they'd barely be good enough for a nuclear blast, for God's sakes, right? So those are some of the basics, right? So what is the nuclear bomb? What is it? How does it work? What was the Manhattan Project? Well, the theory of a nuclear bomb is, it is linked to Einstein's theory E equals mc squared, which essentially to surmise, quite logically, that we're all made of the same stuff. At a fundamental level, it's all the same stuff. And that you can convert slow-moving energy into fast-moving energy, or entangled energy, which is mistaken as slow-moving energy, and get it to essentially fight its way out of its nuclear constraints. And it's something we call fission. Now, fission is a theory that if you can get an atom with a tremendous number of electrons, and this is the orbiting matter around this atom theory, right? Again, the Coral Castle guy says that at the center is a photon, not a proton neutron. But again, it's a classification of how fast energy moves. That's what we call a proton, a neutron, an electron. But if you get an atom that's very, very heavy, physically you can pick up the stuff and it's really heavy in your hand, like gold, which is actually pretty stable. It's very conductive material. But you get something like uranium. Uranium is crazy. Uranium has an atom that is too big for its britches. It has anywhere from 234 electrons per atom orbiting the outside, up to 238 electrons orbiting on the outside. What that does is that it has a radioactive emission from it because it can't hang on to itself. It is too big. It shouldn't exist. It's sort of the technicality of the universe. This atom was probably created at the center of some huge gravitational pull situation, which is the only way that you can force matter into an atomic orbit. And it constantly emits its electrons. And those electrons are very radioactive. So if you were to hold a uranium bar in your hand's getting exposed to a tremendous amount of lethal radiation. Madame Curie, who figured out that uranium had this ability, was that she was storing, she's a scientist, a nuclear physicist, she was storing uranium bars in her desk. And she was also storing film that she was using to track emissions from radioactive materials. On one particular day, she put a bar of uranium on top of a package of film. Later, they developed the film, which had other exposures on it, but there was this giant rectangle of blackness because it had been completely exposed through the envelope into the film. And that's when they realized, oh my God, this is in the shape of the bar, and the bar must be emitting this stuff. Madame Curie died of cancer for being exposed to it by uranium bars. It's really tragic, right? The Manhattan Project was a project to make something called plutonium. Because what they theorized was this. If you can get some of these electrons that are popping off of this real unstable material called uranium, if you can get one electron to pierce the interior of another atom right down the center, you can destabilize the center, the protons and the neutrons in the center of that atom, and cause it to split. And when that happens, it's going to release a tremendous amount of energy, and essentially the entire atom that you've split turns into a confetti bomb of other electrons and other nuclear materials that can then disturb neighboring atoms. And it's usually, fission is described, in theory, it's more violent than the theory, but you have one atom splits two, two split four, four split eight. So you have this exponential curve of energy release. To put it in perspective, when you do the math of what they say happens, okay, we don't know if it does happen, but what they say happens, if you converted the ink on a piece of paper that composes a period, right, almost a two-dimensional plane, in theory, of ink in a period, you could blow up probably the average country block in a town. That's how much force would come out of that tiny bit of energy, or a tiny bit of ink, which is energy, but it's just captivated into its form, right? So what's unclear is whether or not they tried to test uranium by itself. And the theory is, the way that an atom bomb works in theory, at least the Fat Boy at the beginning, was that they would take a very highly volatile material, like uranium, and we're going to get to plutonium in a second here, and you surround it with dynamite, C4, whatever, TNT, pure TNT was the Fat Boy, and you run a bunch of blasting caps to this, basically a soccer ball looking hexagonal map around the actual interior of the unstable stuff. You measure out a bunch of gold wires to all be the same length. So if the plunger, for instance, is closer to the right side of this ball, they would take gold wire and wind it so it had the same distance as the one that's got to come from completely the other side of the ball. And then you plunge, and the electrons take the same amount of time to get to all sides of this ball at the same time, crushing at the exact same time, crushing that real unstable shit in the center, and hopefully causing all these excited electrons from uranium to pop. Now, I have never heard of them running the test on uranium by itself, but I guarantee you they did before they realized they needed to create something called plutonium. Essentially what they figured out was that for 234 to 238, not all of it's worthwhile. I believe it's 234 and 235 that is actually the most volatile shit. And so what they try to do is they extract out of plutonium the other counts. I think it's 6, 7, and 8 are pulled out. I believe I have that right. If it's not, it's like 5 and 6. But there's 2 out of the index that are removed, and the rest is actually sold as depleted uranium weaponry. For those of you who've ever heard of DU weapons or depleted uranium weapons and how absolutely toxic they are for the universe, a single uranium atom is going to have its emissions, its lethal Madame Curie killing emissions for approximately 9.5 million year half-life, which means you multiply it times 2. It takes 9.5 million years for it to start to decline in its emissions. So it takes basically 19 million years. Million years for this stuff to be edible so you don't die. That's how lethal this stuff is. And that's just an atomic fact. That has nothing to do with weapons, right? But when they make plutonium, they've got a bunch of uranium left. Most of it is left. And it's harder than steel. It's heavier than every element that on the chart, because uranium is the heaviest stuff that we publicly know about. So when you build a bullet out of it, like a big, A10, 18-inch round that comes out of the Gatling gun on an A10, and you shoot a tank with it, there's no armor that they can create that will deflect a DU round, especially after it's turned into molten steel as it comes out of that tank, that cannon barrel. But they build ordnance out of it. They build armor out of it for big armor tanks. But when it explodes, it puts that dust, a fine metal dust, in the atmosphere all over the Middle East. The Middle East is absolutely toxic due to this stuff. But again, the ruling class of the world don't care who they hurt, as long as they get a little temporary profit, right? They're godless people. So I'm sure that they crushed pure uranium and realized nothing's happening. Just a little pop. So someone came up with the idea that they have to somehow figure out, through trial and error, a lot of trial and error, how to make something called plutonium. If this thing exists, right? It could just be a fable. But a lot of people, survived working on the Manhattan Project, and I think they really did do what they said they did. Whether or not they do it anymore, who knows, right? It doesn't mean that the test footage all of a sudden becomes real. The test footage is fake. No matter what. No matter what. That test footage back in the 40s is utter, it's like train models being blown up, essentially, right? But what they did was they took uranium and they melted it. And this is how I understand it. They melted it, put magnets in it, pulled whatever would stick to the magnet out and wiped it off in another container, and just kept putting the magnet back inside the uranium and pulling it out and wiping it off. And the atomic matter that is in the molten container that won't stick to the magnet is something that is so utterly excited, okay, that it bounces off the magnet. As much as it is attracted to the magnet, its polarity rejects, and therefore it stays in the container. And what you have left is an infinitesimal amount of what we call plutonium. So I would imagine, for instance, if you had a 10 foot by 10 foot block of uranium and you melted it, I'm thinking you would have maybe a golf ball size left that would be considered plutonium. That plutonium is then stored, and it got better over the years, right? So they got better refining mechanisms, and they started figuring out what it is they're trying to look for. It just got better and more lethal and more insane, and the magnitudes got bigger and bigger because they're able to mathematically multiply various grades of plutonium, various multiple warheads of plutonium to get it to be more intense. Like just basically mixing a bigger firecracker, right? But then you have the test. But they surround this with TNT, with that technique I told you about, and they blow it up. And it works. And there's a 1 megaton bomb. Big, big explosion. They got 20 miles away because they weren't sure how big this was going to be. And if you think about it, fission really is a terrifying concept. The only way a fission reaction stops is through the sheer attrition of inertia from the rest of the universe trying to stop the reaction from happening. You know, if you have a little bonfire on your patio, that it's only going to emit heat for a certain distance and then it starts getting cold, right? So that's sort of how it stops. But what do we see? They videotape it and we see a giant mushroom cloud happen and a big shockwave that goes out and then comes back in. Now, for those of you who have played with various flammable powders in your lifetime, what's really interesting is probably the first time I did this was with black powder. The second time I did it was with titanium shavings. But any sort of powder that is flammable, you make a pile of it on a sidewalk, and I suggest you don't do this personally unless you really know what you're doing. But you light it on fire with a fuse, whatever. Do not stand next to it with some barbecue lighter. Use some type of detonation mechanism. But you will see a gigantic plume that looks just like a mushroom cloud. It will be a mushroom cloud because it is the properties of an explosive material in an atmosphere. Without an atmosphere, you get a ball and it's just all unified. But with gravity pulling down or pushing down, however you want to look at it, you're going to get a rolling cloud. This is fighting the atmosphere as it goes up. Okay. Now here's where the theory goes to the next level. There are dozens and dozens of videos of our government stacking up TNT into silos to the exact yields of 1 megaton, 2 megaton, what have you, half a megaton, and popping it all at the same time. And the result looks exactly like an atom bomb, and I mean identical in all principles and all ways, except in theory, the conventional bomb, which is not using radioactive material or fission, is non-radioactive to the bystanders. Now here's one of the other pieces of evidence about nuclear bombs that actually yields to its demise in theory, is that they would blow up these bombs in the desert here in America, and then the scientists would go straight to ground center. The military were encouraged to walk to the center after the bomb just to see how it would affect and what they would find, how hot it was and that sort of thing. One of my friend's dads watched Bikini Island explosions over and over again, right? So these explosions did happen. But what I don't know of is a bunch of soldiers dying of cancer. Not even in the conspiratorial world do you have a bunch of soldiers dying of cancer. And so if you had a nuclear bomb go off, with all this EMP waves just bursting through your body, which is supposed to leave you okay, but having just a bunch of radioactive fallout, then these places should be inhabitable for quite a long time. All right, let's go to the next thing, which is the end of World War II. The end of World War II is, the Germans were just defeated. All the Nazis escaped to Argentina, including Adolf Hitler. And the Japanese were holding out the Pacific Rim battle, but we were closing in quick. We had a ground invasion that was potentially going to kill anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million people, of theirs and ours, and so the decision was made to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are videotapes of this, or movie reels of the Ola Ray or what, I forgot what it was called, but the bomber that did it. Nagasaki actually was dropped in the wrong place. It was actually dropped in a sort of a countryside away from the actual major city, thank God. So you have a couple things. If nuclear bombs don't exist, then how on earth do we have footage of the giant plume that comes out of at least Hiroshima? Right, the Nagasaki explosion is a little, I think, less elaborate in its video, but the one from Hiroshima is horrifying. We have individuals alive today who were children at the time who remember it. We have incredible deaths. We have all kinds of stories. There's a whole book. I think it's just called The Atomic Bomb. It's super thick. I don't know if I still have my copy, but it's horrific. It shows you all of the radioactive burns. It shows you the burn marks on the ground where people were utterly vaporized and turned to like a black shadow of themselves on the sidewalk. Horrendous, right? But then some idiot, I'm just using that as an empathetic term by someone else, says that these things didn't exist. How dare anyone say these things don't exist? Supposedly 80,000 people were essentially vaporized or killed within hours or days after Hiroshima happened. My buddy saw it, went down, lived there within a couple of years as a child. All right, we got some problems here, don't we? Atomic bombs are very radioactive. How is it that a bomb goes off, spreads a bunch of nuclear material in the form of tiny particles of this plutonium that you could breathe, and how does the society rebuild itself there within 100,000 years, let alone 19 million years? There might be scientists that say it so diffuses into the atmosphere, diffuses into the soil, that it's actually okay. And maybe that's the truth. But now how would anyone detonate something that looks like an atomic bomb if it weren't an atomic bomb? Well, now, what are the counter theories? Before I answer that question, what are the counter theories by the people who assert that these nuclear bombs never existed? Well, what they say is that the footage that we saw of the big mushroom cloud coming out of that region isn't actually what happened. That it was actually firebombed over the course of several hours, and that's how Nagasaki got destroyed, and Hiroshima. But that doesn't correlate with what people saw. People saw flashes. I mean, someone could be revising history, but you have people that were in bomb shelters, okay, that said that they were under, layers of soil. Not that thick, but layers of soil. And when that bomb went off, they could see they had their eyes closed, and they could not only see the sun, as bright as it's ever been in their life, but they could also see their bones in their hands as they put them over their face. It was so bright. So unless those stories are fake, and we know that they faked stories about other major events in World War II history, right? They've even caught people on videotapes giving testimonies in their living rooms and then changing the story when a movie's made about it. How those people can live with themselves, I don't know. But there, out of all the research that I've read, there are just a few key stories that really keep those events locked in history exactly the way they were described. And who am I to doubt them at all? I just want to say that there's not, I don't personally know of like 36 people that have all those stories, but there probably are. There are probably hundreds of people with those stories. But now, how could you create a big mushroom cloud and a destructive atom bomb looking event in Hiroshima? How could you do it? Well, if you ever look at the pictures of Hiroshima before the bomb happened, you're talking about a fairly remote city. And, Japan, it wasn't Tokyo. Japan was not on top of all the technology. They did have the Japanese Zero. There's some badass people. I mean, they definitely were brilliant and they have this amazing culture and stuff. But at the time, Hiroshima looked fairly traditional. Not that many tall buildings. Most of the buildings were built out of wood, and so knocking them over was actually pretty darn easy. I've even read papers where architects said there shouldn't have been anything left, and there were several buildings that actually managed to keep almost together. They had a little bit of a remnant of a second-story building, and this was almost at ground zero, or was at ground zero. There should have been a crater had a 1 megaton bomb been dropped. Even an airburst, right? Let's think about this. The Allies, this is the only thing I can imagine. This is the only way, and I've never heard this theorized, other than the firebombing. That's the only excuse that the people who say this stuff doesn't exist come up with, right? The only thing I can imagine is that somehow someone procures a warehouse somewhere in Hiroshima, and they deliver packages over and over and over to a warehouse. And those packages total 1 megaton, and they're all full of TNT. Hell, we had Japanese people in America that were loyal to America. They could be smuggled in over there, and they'd be Japanese people procuring real estate, putting this thing together, and then we stack up a bunch of TNT because we'd already tested it a bunch of times in the desert in America. And all that happens is that the B-52 or whatever dropped it, supposedly, merely goes over to videotape it. And they pop the bomb in a warehouse, and there you go. You got a 1 megaton bomb, conventional weapon, no radioactivity whatsoever. You have a concussive wave that blows the living crap out of the place. People see the giant fireballs. People are vaporized. So all the traditional stories happen. Anything that's blamed on radioactivity could simply be burns. Just normal old thermal burns. Sure, you could say it's a magical energy called radioactivity. But if you look at all the photographs in the atomic bomb book, there's nothing really that changes what you see on these horrific bodies that have been damaged from just a big thermal cloud burning them up. They wouldn't know what happened. They wouldn't know what hit them, especially everyone who's gone. But people observing it from afar would see a giant burst, and it's over. So that's a theory I've never heard suggested by people who say, did nuclear bombs exist? But didn't Russia do this? Well, what would Russia have to do to simulate an explosion? Well, how do they describe a nuclear bomb in the first place? It's a 1 megaton bomb. Well, what's 1 megaton mean? Oh, what that means is if you stacked up 1 megaton of TNT, it would be exactly that size. Well, we know that there's I think there's over 3 dozen videos of us doing that exact thing, stacking up a silo of TNT and popping it. So why wouldn't the Russians just do that, videotape it, and say they've got it? What about the hydrogen bomb? The hydrogen bomb is using essentially a hydrogen atom, the most primitive atom in the universe, and they're splitting that thing. The yield is better, and hydrogen just turns into vaporous water. Problem: the way that you detonate a hydrogen bomb is to use an atom bomb. I'm not sure how they do it, if they surround some hydrogen golf ball inside of a softball of plutonium, pop it, I don't know how it works. We've seen air bursts. What is definitely the case is this: if the airburst videos are real, then there is, in my opinion, there's no physical way to lift 1 megaton of TNT into the air and drop it out of a plane and pop it. It simply weighs too much for a jet to pick up and take up there. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong if there's jet engines that could do that, especially in the 40s. But I think the only way that you get a 1 megaton yield from in the sky is to create something like a nuclear fission bomb and drop it out of a plane. I think that's the only way you can do it. But then there was all this development during the Cold War. There was the invention of the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. Purpose? Take a nuclear payload, a plutonium-tipped missile that has an atom bomb in it from anywhere from 1 megaton to 100 megatons now. Pop it out into the air, out of a missile silo or a Trident submarine. It flies across the world and hits the enemy, right? The upgrade by the mid-'80s was to do multiple warheads. You ever seen the game, or seen the movie War Game? You'll see the kind of missile command thing. It's probably happened in the 70s or 60s, but, it was real popularized, I guess, in 82 or so when the war games came out. But now everything went underground. So if nuclear weapons exist, there's probably 4 countries that absolutely have them. The United States of America, Russia, the United Kingdom, and Israel. Israel gets a copy of everything. Israel gets a copy of absolutely everything. And, Los Alamos Labs, as a matter of fact, seem to have almost an institutionalized leak as part of that organization. They always had Chinese people working for them that defected to China and took all the secrets with them. It happened over and over and over again, and it was as if they couldn't stop the leak. They kept bringing in more foreign scientists from China, and they kept defecting. It happened, half a dozen times in the 80s and 90s. It was just because I was working with Los Alamos Labs at the time on a different project, and it was like a joke on the telephone. Like, oh, you got another one. If this is a matter of spreading the most deadly weapon on planet Earth, it would seem like that shit could be guarded a little bit better. So China supposedly has them because of that reason, right? Now again, China's been pretty cool. Everybody freaks out about China, but if you think about it, China attacks China. China has civil wars. China has its, Soviet communist country, but they don't have any record, I think for 400 years, attacking any of their neighbors. They attack their cousins. They're the Mongols and that kind of stuff. I don't believe they've even attacked Japan. Just Japan has attacked China, right? The Nanking massacres, right? But 1973, after all of these tests, they bury the ability internationally, making it an international felony for any country to detonate an atomic bomb above ground. Primarily due to the radioactive signature and fallout that happens as a result of blowing one of these things up. Now, as I said before, just to put a footnote in this, in the United States we have cattle mutilations, which are blamed on UFOs. In my circles, it's been connected to surveying the mouth tissue and the anus tissue of a animal that forages off of the green nature, and what they're trying to do is calculate the radioactive differential between the absorption at the mouth, which is more, and the absorption at the back end to see over the course of ingesting whatever's missing from front to back is what the being has actually ingested in its fiber, and that can let them calculate cancer rates and all that kind of stuff. So in America, we probably have a lot of cancer simply because of the folks that live from where the test sites were to the East Coast, right? I will note that all the tests were as far away from the ruling class in Europe as configurably possible, right? So we started in the deserts, southwest deserts of America, and then we pushed it to Bikini Island in the Pacific, further away from the ruling class, once they figured out that the fallout could actually probably get to Europe. So keep that in mind. So now, since 1973, we've had some people supposedly join the nuclear power race. And one of them was, I believe, India went first and then Pakistan went second. Now, what is the videotape evidence that they actually have nuclear weapons? A ground burst. Ground bursts are amazing. They swell up. I mean, it's like taking, like 50 acres, and all of a sudden the whole ground just swells and comes down. Something's been blown up in the ground. But since we know that you can bury megatons of TNT and pop it, the only thing you need to do to tell the rest of the world that you have nuclear weapons and fear us is to put a bunch of TNT in the ground and pop it, and then all of a sudden it looks like you're in the nuclear race. But you're actually not. Thank God. But Pakistan is the counterpart to India, and so of course they had it right after that. Now, what are the odds that this incredibly coveted knowledge is somehow just immediately usurped by the neighbor? Technically speaking, that's not very likely without someone leaking it across the border, right? But if it's just a game of popping stuff in the ground and proving it, then you got it, right? So who is the most recent addition to supposedly the nuclear arms race? North Korea. I'm going to tell you that North Korea, by no means, has ever detonated a nuclear bomb on as a result of their innovation in the history of the country. There was a story in the South Korea that supposedly a nuclear bomb was dropped on a train station to try and kill Kim Jong-il, I believe, the father Kim Jong-un. And, there was all this aerial photographs from satellites showing a big cleanup that happened on the ground. But what are they missing? Well, anything related to looking like a nuclear weapon, even a small suitcase nuke, didn't look anything like it. Something happened. Something exploded. Could have been just a nice conventional bomb, something on a train track that it was loaded up and blown up. Could have been a chemical mistake, whatever. But anytime they can create this axis of evil, some other thing you can pay attention to instead of who are really the enemies, which are people that are making, Hillary Clinton innocent, and then asking for immunity like the head of the FBI, they love it. But since that train thing, supposedly this assassination attempt, which again is illegal under international law, you're not allowed to assassinate other leaders, even though we try to do it all the time, and Saddam Hussein's killed and Muammar Gaddafi's been murdered, and it's just great. Now they're trying to kill Assad. It's just nuts, right? We don't need any stinking laws. Supposedly North Korea has done 2 more missile tests, or nuclear bomb tests. All right. There hasn't been a single ounce of footage of these tests. Not stuff buried in the ground and exploded, because I'm willing to bet that with the constrained resources of North Korea, again, they have to get 65% of all their strategic resources from China just to keep their country from dying, from starving to death. I'm sure that getting 100 megatons of TNT would be very, very difficult for them. So there's no above ground tests and there's no below ground tests. It's all just a big rumor mill to make people who breathe through their mouth more often than not believe that there's something going on there. So I'm going to tell you that if you sit at night crying in your pillow due to some fear that North Korea has nuclear weapons, if that ever were to be the case, it would be because China handed them one. Or they bought one off the black market if they truly exist. Now, you go back to my shop teacher. And for those of you who've heard every single episode, this is a bit of a repeat, but now we're right on the subject. Now, I didn't have him as a shop teacher. I had him as a specialized mathematics teacher. He was the metal teacher. There was a wood shop and a metal shop. He's the metal teacher. But his training, as per his own admissions, is that he was trained to build dirty bombs, and he was stationed in Guam during the Pacific Rim War. What I find, I guess he was probably in his 50s when my dad was in his 30s. So that makes sense time-wise. He was in his 20s during World War II. But I looked at him and I said, what's a dirty bomb? He says, they taught us how to make bombs, nuclear bombs, small nukes, out of just average everyday material. And being this, massive, physics student, and, especially having spent a lot of time learning about fission and nuclear reactors and nuclear bombs, I'm looking at this guy going, so you were able to, on a little island in Guam with bamboo and a little tiki torch, you're able to recreate the Philadelphia project? The Manhattan Project. Let's get that straight. The Manhattan Project, something they built a giant building for with 10,000 employees, and he just looked at me and he goes, because I said, you're essentially able to make plutonium on an island, really? And he looked at me with this stare. It was like, you little bastard, you little indignant fucker to suggest that I'm lying to you. And he just said, there's a lot of ways to make stuff unstable. So being the cocky bastard I am, I just said, all right, tell me. We're right here, right now. Tell me. The whole class is like watching us now. And he had been doing these castings using, I guess, pot steel or whatever. You can make a mold and then you cast it. So he was teaching the class how to do that on the other classes, right? We had to walk across the street to the shop class to take this weird math course. But he says, you see that right there? I said, yeah. He goes, if we heated that up with, we take this container and we put a metal in there and we melt it down, I stick a magnet in it and I pull it out and push everything off the magnet and keep doing that. And he goes, whatever's left is really unstable. And he goes, the more we start with unstable stuff, the more stuff we get at the end. Because that's all we need. Now, I didn't go further to ask him, what material he would have on Guam, whether he had a little suitcase of uranium or whatever the case might be. God damn, did you hear that? For some reason, we got fighter jets flying over Huntington Beach right now. And we are not by 4th of July, okay? World War II, baby. They're preparing for Hillary to be president right now. World War III. God, that just sounds amazing, let me tell you. So, it just clears your mind, I swear to God. So now here's the thing. My shop teacher, who's also credited with inventing the guitar pickup, he got the patent for 11 months, made money for 11 months until they moved his patent to Germany and started making it over there. And then somewhere after that, Les Paul gets the credit for creating it. His name is Mr. Reading. Great guy. Great dude. When I heard this story, I was like, okay, this guy is telling me the truth. He is absolutely telling me the truth. He's not a tall tale guy. He's a very stoic guy, but very sweet. He was taught how to make dirty bombs with a full theory of plutonium creation using magnets. All right? So, if we doubt that nuclear weapons exist, then we have to account for people like him and their theory of this, right? The fact that the buildings that were assigned to the Manhattan Project, I believe, are still tourable, right? Or they at least videotaped the crap out of them before they got rid of them. But now, let's get into plutonium creation today. Because obviously, somewhere in the world, plutonium is being created. It's talked about all the time. There's different types of plutonium that's really super duper refined. I can only imagine that after they make the stage 1 plutonium, they put it through a separate process. They make stage 2 and stage 3 and stage 4. I can only imagine that's the way it works. I don't know anybody who's done it. But here's my personal theory of why I think that nuclear power plants exist. There's this weird thing that they won't allow Arab countries to have nuclear power plants unless they're kissing some serious Western ass. Despite all the uranium in Africa, they won't let the entire continent of Africa have one nuclear power plant. I'm not aware of a single power plant, even in South Africa, that exists on that continent. But now, why do they always say they won't let Iran have a nuclear power plant? Well, it's always revealed. It's always revealed that that is a proxy to creating plutonium through refining rods, very radioactive rods, in some process that then makes them ripe for plutonium manufacturing. Now, I'm not sure what the connection is. Now, a nuclear reactor, the way it works in traditional sense, is you have really radioactive rods. They have cesium and strontium and uranium and all kinds of wild shit in them, right? I'm not exactly sure what the most modern day reactor is, because it takes 30 years to build one, and so by the time you have one built, you have an arcane creation. But you take a bunch of rods and you put them in a grid, hanging inside this grid. Once the rods are within a certain proximity of each other, and there's a number of them, a fission reaction starts. It's controlled. It's a very small reaction. Unlike a nuclear bomb, it simply agitates and splits atoms within this water that then becomes boiled. This water is not normal water. The water is called clean water. It has very little salt content in it. It's clean water. It's like pure H2O, right? And that water eventually gets so bombarded by the rods that eventually it becomes toxic, and we have to store it somewhere. Now, supposedly, there's very little toxic waste in the world as related to a nuclear power plant. However, a buddy of mine, Robert Llewell in the UK, who studies electric cars, has done the math on this and did an episode on it in his, I think, Fully Charged episodes, that, if you live 72 years and you are using nuclear power as a result of your existence, that you'll be responsible for a ball about a little bit shy of a ping pong ball size of this really super radioactive water, which I don't know why it wouldn't continue working forever. It should just continue working forever. Perhaps it gets so bombarded that it won't boil anymore. It's kind of hard to believe. But they boil the water, they put that boiling water through turbines, the turbines spin, and it creates alternating current, which can then be stabilized into DC if you need it. Now, it is my belief that these rods, when kept in proximity with each other for a number of years, become more and more unstable until they have to be replaced. But the more and more unstable they become, by bombarding each other and creating this minor fission reaction within this pool of water, I believe that they become ripe for turning into plutonium. They remove the rod, they take it off to be processed, and they put a new rod in its place. I don't know if they have to do all the rods at the same time, or that I can pull one out. I would imagine they can all leave at the same time. The reason why Fukushima supposedly went critical is that the water drained out of the container and you just had rods hanging nearly dry. And they just kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter without being stabilized by the water, because the water is a nice insulator. Tiny bit of insulation, right? The way that you stop a nuclear reaction inside of a nuclear reactor is to insert lead rods between them, thus cutting off their communication on a fission level, and it reduces the reaction. The other one is to separate them physically, but I don't know of any design that does that. The one I did as a child did that by separating the rods into what looks like essentially a revolver gun barrel. And so you just put you put four concentric revolvers underneath the rods, and you can rotate the rods, drop them into these rotation pads, and pull them all away from each other. During a crisis, you could store them away from each other. They're still hot, but they're not going to pop and melt down and create a China syndrome. Then when everything stabilizes, you use electric motors to push them all back into place, and there goes your fission reaction again. The reason why all of our reactors go tits up is that they're just fixed into place, and you can't move them. The only thing you do is insert stuff to cool them off. But at the end, if you lose electricity, shit like Fukushima can happen, right? So I believe that there's a potential that nuclear reactors just happen to have this byproduct, that it boils water, and that it spins a turbine. The water can be used to spin a turbine, and then you have power. So as they make a bunch of plutonium, they get a bunch of power out of it. So it would be a fairly ingenious thing if we absolutely needed to be at war, which we don't, right? But now here's the big question. If you believe that nuclear bombs didn't exist, then you might actually sleep a little better at night, right? Because the ultimate type of war can't occur because these bombs don't exist. Now, at times during the Cold War of the 80s and 90s, as everything cooled off after the coup in Russia, and we technically speaking beat Russia, the amount of nuclear warheads started getting decommissioned supposedly and thrown away. Two things there. If you make better bombs, if one bomb can do the job of 10 bombs or 100 bombs, then you could actually reduce your arsenal by 90% and still have the exact same arsenal, because one bomb can do a lot more than the others. Now, when I was in school in 1986, I took a class where, it was really strange. It was I think it was a courtship and marriage class, which I've talked about a couple times on episodes, and our teacher, Mr. Drewhart, he had a female friend, who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, and her job was to monitor the viability of the nuclear weapon arsenal of Russia. And I think she was still active in doing this, and she was allowed to tell us, okay, because here I am, this guy that just studies that shit, And I asked her, I said, so what's the verdict on their arsenal? And she said, she goes, we're pretty certain that around 97% of their arsenal could not reach the United States. So their ICBMs are not good enough to get here. Either guidance systems aren't that good, or their propellant is not that good. And I said, well, what about that 3%? I'm like 16, 17 years old interviewing this woman. Then she says something very interesting. She says, of the 3% that land here, she says that we believe 95% plus of those will simply bounce on the ground and never detonate because their bombs are so inferior. I thought that was very interesting. So if nuclear bombs do not exist, what's interesting is this woman's entire career was based on monitoring fiction all day long, every single day. Getting intel on propulsion systems, guidance systems, the quality of plutonium, the quality of yield, all that stuff. Probably down to an infinitesimal level that you and I would find hard to understand. And that's in 1986, 87, somewhere in there, that she was telling me this and the whole class this information. But now, why haven't we fought a nuclear war since then? Certainly fought a lot of wars, haven't we? Why won't we drop these things? Hey, we did it over, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they're living large, right? Doesn't seem to affect the ground. Chernobyl goes tits up, and now they're saying that it's completely, the vegetation there is insanely great, and no one's got cancer there. But it was a massive plume of radioactive material that came out of this thing. 5,000 to 8,000 guys who helped clean up the place died, and they were only there a few seconds, shoveling something off the roof and leaving with these lead plates on their bodies, and they all died of it. But now it's all safe. Is it because they cleaned it up really, really well? I mean, there's definitely some heroes that were born that day, right? Fukushima is now off limits. It's turning into this, Chernobyl, Fukushima being rated anywhere from 15 times to 50 times what Chernobyl was. With Fukushima, you have engineers from Germany that were working in Fukushima on Reactor 4 for a month and a half, literally up until the week of the explosion there. And they said that that there were no rods in Reactor 4 that had been completely disassembled. And so seeing it explode on television, these German engineers were like, that's impossible. There's nothing in there to explode. So we're not quite sure what happened there, right? I've got other episodes where I talk about, the tsunami nukes, right? Probably should do a whole episode on tsunami nukes, but I don't know if I can go for an hour. The digression there is that we haven't heard of tsunamis until Christmas 2004, where the supposedly 11.0 earthquake happens in Indonesia. 280,000 people die. And all of a sudden we had tsunamis everywhere. For those of you that remember the earthquake off the coast of Santa Cruz, like a 6.5 or something like that, or whatever it was, 7.0, you had Santa Cruz that got ripped to hell, but you didn't have a tsunami. And then you have San Francisco, which I think got a 5.8 at the time against a slapper, so the ground went up and down, tears the crap out of San Francisco. But no tsunami in 89. But now it seems like all earthquakes happen off the coast, and all earthquakes create tsunamis. It's weird. The Fukushima earthquake was 9.0. Some people have it at 9.2. That's twice an 8, and 8's twice a 7. 7's twice a 6. I mean, that's a massive pop. And, you got buildings on the coast of Japan that were absolutely fine until the tsunami arrives. So it's as if we didn't have an earthquake. It's as if we had a giant concussive wave in the ocean, which pushed a bunch of water inland. First sucked it out, then pushed it in. Who knows, right? But now, what's the climate of the world in the fall, although it's about 85 degrees out right now, in the fall of 2016, right now? We have a lot of warnings going on that a nuclear war might be inevitable if certain people get in power. You have two candidates running for president. One is well liked by foreign factions and is willing to discuss all resolutions to all matters, and one that's saying that she wants to put a no-fly zone over Syria. Now, a no-fly zone imposed on a country that you have no existing real direct war theater with is an act of war. So it's declaring war on Syria. The United States would be declaring war on Syria with a no-fly zone over Syria. Well, Syria's greatest ally is Russia. Russia is on the list of nuclear bombs, of having that arsenal. They've already warned in the press several times that they have intel that says that the United States of America, under the administration of Hillary Clinton, is absolutely ready to start the very first nuclear war in this world. And that might be hype, that might be real. At some point, if you've ever seen the movie by Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Strangelove, you will note that the fictional character played by George C. Scott is always resorting to a military option. Even the Twilight Zone To Serve Man had a general that was always nuclear options, hit him with everything we got sort of thing, right? When you build up an army with a bunch of ICBMs and Tomahawk missiles and stealth helicopters and stealth bombers and all this other stuff, the arsenal does deteriorate in the warehouse. And so you have two options. Find a way to dispose of it safely, blow it up, do whatever you got to do, which is not very fun, unless it's 4th of July and you want to have a good finale to your show, or you find a reason to fight a war. And if you find a reason to fight a war, then people die. But you have to elect candidates that are going to support the theater of war, which makes a lot of people happy. Right? Weapons manufacturers owned by European banking cartels really love it. They got no skin in the game besides making profit off the dead souls of the victims of war, the soldiers and the people the soldiers kill. So it is my dear hope that one of two things are true. That either nuclear weapons are merely a fictional creation supported by a bunch of carefully orchestrated visuals, which is, for me, still very hard to believe because of the reasons I just noted, or that if they exist, that those who run the world do realize that if you do detonate a bunch of these things, that a couple things happen. One, the fallout would be insane. But, you know, if you were to nuke Syria and nuke Russia, that due to the way that the jet stream works and the atmosphere works, maybe they've done all the calculations that the fallout will stick away from Europe. Because it'd have to go completely around the world to land back on Europe. It might land on the United States of America, but they don't give a shit about us. Our controllers do not give a shit about the United States of America. Maybe it won't hit America. I don't know. I haven't done any math. I don't have any simulation software to figure that out. But now, what would a nuclear war do? The theory is that, you know, the initial theory is, well, if you're an arrogant American and a stupid American, then you think that the only bombs that will ever be dropped will be on Syria, will be on Russia. That'll be the only two places in the world that these bombs get dropped. Again, don't forget China being an ally over there. China and Russia have done a gigantic deal to sell oil to each other. Right? The BRICS currency, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China. It is a conglomerate of folks trying to create their own currencies outside of the influence of the world banks. I think China is still being wooed by manufacturing to join and use European money. And again, I think there's 49 central banks in China that are owned by the Rothschilds, so there could definitely be control apparatuses in there. But what if they just decided to push them out one day? I guarantee you that some of the most sophisticated missiles in the world and submarines in the world to administer those missiles are on gigantic submarines created by very brilliant Russian scientists. At any point in time, if one nuclear bomb is ever dropped on Russian soil, the world will be unrecognizable about 2 hours later. Because all those submarines that they created that are stealthy as stealthy could be will start launching like crazy. We'll launch, they'll launch. It'll be a bad Twilight Zone. All first world countries gone. And because America is used as Thor's hammer on behalf of the bankers, right? The big lead tip is the American soldier, the Christian, God-fearing person at the end, doing all the damage to all these Middle Eastern countries in the name of Jesus Christ. But the handle goes back to the European banking cartels and the shilly people like Hillary Clinton that actually are willing to sell everybody out. Believe me, they'll be on some billionaire island in the southern hemisphere of the world when all this shit happens. They'll be in their contingency of government white planes flying around watching the show like a big giant video game. So it's imperative that we do not ever do anything as citizens of this country to give power to people that have already said at their podiums within their campaign pitches to the people that they're going to take moves that could risk a war with someone like Russia And fucking with Syria is the way that you start a war with Russia. Before we end this thing, I want to talk about fusion, which is the other thing you'll hear about. What we're told about the sun, this is the best place for you to think about fusion happening. For those of you who've ever seen Back to the Future, when the Doctor comes back at the end of the series, at the end of the first episode, he has a different device on the back of his car, his DeLorean, that feeds the flux capacitor, and it's a fusion engine. I think it's like a blender or something, right? But he's sticking trash in the thing, and he's able to turn it into energy. So fusion is the inverse of fission. An atomic atom, regardless of what it's made out of, is made out of orbital mass, energy. The way that you synthesize gold out of a straw of hay is to put so much hay in a machine and that you can fusion it together and use all of its atomic energy and push the orbital patterns and the interior orbital patterns to create the right amount of protons, neutrons, and electrons to be a gold atom. And there's all these Rumpelstiltskin stories about alchemy using chemicals to turn a piece of hay into gold, right? It's the old fable, right? Supposedly if you take carbon and you crush the shit out of it, you make a cubic zirconian diamond. The difference between a cubic zirconian diamond and a real diamond is that the cubic zirconian is perfect and a diamond has flaws. So when they try to look at a diamond really close to see if it's fake, they're looking for dust particles, black particles inside the diamond. If there are none, it's fake. If they have some, it's real. And then when they find out it's real, they oddly go back to the standard of how clear the diamond is, and that's how much it will sell for, whether it has a yellow tint or a white tint. So it's really funny. So if you have a cubic zirconian ring and you feel bad about it, you probably shouldn't, because you have the most pure diamond on planet Earth. It's just not revered as naturally made, right? That's sort of an organic way of creating fusion. But it is gravity and the crushing force of gravity, however you want to theorize that existing, that makes fusion occur, typically. Now, you could probably use electricity and slam things together and literally build an atom using a machine if you really could come up with the technology. But on the surface of the sun, the reason why the sun keeps burning forever and ever and ever, even with my Eric Dollard adaptation, which is that I believe it is a plasma core, and I believe that all planets and moons are all plasma cores, which are hollow energy cores. The outer surface of the sun, because it's so massive, that as it turns its material that's willing to burn on the surface into a combustible energy, the reason why it's able to keep going forever is that the overwhelming majority of everything it expels from its surface comes back to the surface using gravity, and that it is crushed back into a combustible. So imagine taking gasoline, burning it up, but if you could keep all of the carbon atoms that come out of gasoline and crush them back into a methane gas, crude oil, back into a refined gas, by taking out the carbon atoms, you could have gasoline again. Currently it takes too much energy to do that, so we don't try. But when you have a gravity well like the sun, that's blocking a bunch of ethereal winds, you have crushing gravity that can do this all day long for billions, if not trillions of years. There's the theory I'll just throw in here at the last second, which is this idea of a supernova. They filmed a bunch of things in space where you have this big cloudy, burning ball in space, and they theorize to you that that's a supernova. And the theory is that eventually, because you don't adopt the Eric Dollard technique of what the sun really is, they're trying to tell you that the entire sun is a gigantic ball of hydrogen helium mainly, and with a little bit of everything else, including oxygen, and that it will eventually burn up. That tiny percentage that's escaping constantly, never coming back, will actually burn up the mass of the sun to the point where it will not be able to hold itself together due to gravity, and it'll expand pretty much to the orbit of, I think, Jupiter, and everything inside gets burned because it's still hot as hell, right? Now, if it's a plasma core, I guarantee you that will never happen. And I would guess that if it's a plasma core, the sun is actually growing in diameter by sucking in a bunch of other ethereal winds and other energy particles and just constantly charging the interior of the sun, making that plasma core ball bigger and bigger and bigger, which is hollow and empty and not doing much. When you see a sunspot, you're looking into the bowels of the sun. which is black. Earth expands 19 centimeters a year because we have a plasma core that's growing, because we're always becoming a bigger target of the sun, because we get its atomic power, its atomic energy, particles of all kinds of atomic base units, and it goes into the core of our planet and grows. Okay, the Blue Angels are doing maneuvers off the coast. They're blowing a huge chemical trail. It's looking pretty cool. So hopefully that straightens up a few things for you guys. It gives you a lot more meat on the bones of the theory of all this stuff. I have never heard, quite frankly, a conclusive assertion that nuclear bombs don't exist. I've just heard a couple, well, we think they fake some footage to scare the shit out of the Russians. We just happen to scare the shit out of Americans. Anytime you scare your citizens with a boogeyman from another country and exacerbate this nuclear era thing, right, duck and cover, you get control over your people, because they're not paying attention to you, they're paying attention to this bigger threat. And that's the huge benefit to doing such a thing. The psychological thing, which I guess I will totally end on, is it's sad that we have externalized our macho bravado programming. Well, I guess I should say it differently. Man, and I mean male man, Y chromosome man, is programmed still to hunt every day for food. If we lost that instinct and we had some sort of cataclysmic thing that happens, whether it be a natural disaster, some sort of meteorite, crazy storms that destroy the world or whatever, and if we don't have the ability to hunt and reactivate that gene, then we're going to perish. And overall, probably 99% of the world would perish if that sort of reset occurred. But the problem is we have this in us. I will tell you that the reason why gangster rap and heavy metal is very popular is because it calls to that inner core of man. We need macho externalizations of this rage that we have to kill animals that we can't resolve any other way. The problem is that it's now turned into video games and it's turned into war. But war is alluring, and it fills and satiates a need in man to exude and almost exhaust this rage. It's no mystery that the guys in your neighborhood who are brutes, whether they be good-hearted people or not, it's no mystery why they join the military to get out of their system. When I was 18 years old, I wanted to join the Marines, and my father kept talking me out of it. But I felt it. I got into technology and diverted my life in a completely different direction. Part of me regrets not doing it, just to have those 2 to 4 years. Now, I would have ended up in Desert Storm and probably injected with a bunch of horrible shit and come down with something they blame on ALS, right? So maybe I dodged a bullet. But if we really want to come at the nuclear bomb threat from all angles, we got to figure out some solution to this inner rage. We have to acknowledge it for one thing and say, we understand. Some women are attracted to men with that gene because they are X chromosomes that are attracted to Y chromosomes, ones that actually behave like, men. And now there's this introduction of the beta male. And everybody's trying to date safe for a little while until they get married and have kids, or that noise happens in the middle of the night and they're wondering whether or not they're going to live because their beta male is huddled in a closet. We've got to temper this by understanding it, right? We got to make sure that being gung-ho and excited about war, especially for Americans, is something that we find a replacement for. Don't try to demasculate or emasculate men. Just try to help them find, solace with it, right? I know you feel me. So hopefully that addresses the request. I forgot the individual that told me to do that. I do not have my cell phone with me, so I apologize. It was a recent comment on one of my other videos. It's been requested several times by, I believe, more than one person, but here you go. Please investigate. Please show me what you have. Let me put a request out there for you guys. If you link a video to me, what happens first is that YouTube flags you as likely spam or hold your comment altogether. So if you post a video link and I don't see it, or you don't see it, if you don't see it, that means that it's been held for me to moderate. I'm not doing anything to do that. Some people come into the channel and they try to promote their bands and a bunch of other stuff. I'll let one of those go by, but if they try to hit multiple videos, I'll start, deleting those. But if you do post a video, please give me a little excerpt of what I'm supposed to see in the video, because I need you to understand I've got 145 plus videos and a bunch of people linking these things, and I can't just arbitrarily watch a 2-hour video without knowing why I'm watching it, right? So if there's some hook in the video, so you might say, hey, at 45 minutes, this really cool thing happens. He starts talking about that. I guarantee you, if I go in and see a hook, I'm probably going to hit the playhead back to 0 and watch the whole thing through. But some of those links have been absolutely instrumental in some of my most popular episodes, so you guys are fueling the content. This episode would not have happened without you guys. I think it was one of you guys that actually linked me to the very first claim that nuclear weapons may not have ever existed and don't exist today. And then it's been through multiple requests that I finally remembered to do it. So realize this is our show, not my show. It's not the me program. It's all for us to hive mind our stuff together. If you dig the series, please subscribe. Remember, it's a variety show. If you dig this episode, please like. Please know I appreciate you guys. And let's just make some more cool videos. Awesome. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.